The bank's notice crumpled in her trembling fingers as Grace Larson stared at the words that spelled out her ruin. And she had exactly 4 hours before the auction block claimed everything her husband had died building. The May sun beat down mercilessly on Eagle Pass, Texas, turning the dusty Main Street into a shimmering ribbon of heat. Grace stood on the porch of her ranch house, watching the horizon as if Samuel might ride back through that gate at any moment, as if the past 6 months had been nothing but a cruel nightmare. But her husband was buried on the hill overlooking the creek, and she was alone with debts that had multiplied like locusts after his death. "Mrs. Larson," a voice called from the path leading up to the house. Grace turned to see Xavier Ramsey dismounting from his horse, his broad-shouldered frame casting a long shadow across the yard. She had hired him 3 weeks ago when she could still afford to pay ranch hands, back when she believed hard work and determination might somehow save her land. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing dark hair dampened with sweat and eyes that held a gentleness she had not expected from a drifter. "The cattle are moved to the north pasture like you asked," he said quietly. "But Mrs. Larson, if you do not mind me speaking plain, moving cattle will not matter much if the bank takes the land this afternoon." Grace felt her throat tighten. "I know that, Mr. Ramsey. I just needed to keep my hands busy, needed to feel like I was doing something." Xavier stepped closer, his weathered face serious. "How much do they want?" $1,200. The number felt like a stone in her mouth. "Samuel borrowed against the ranch 2 years ago when the drought hit. He was so sure we would recover, and we did, mostly. But then he got kicked by that horse and—" She could not finish the sentence. Even now, the memory of watching her husband die slowly from internal injuries made her chest constrict with grief. "That is a considerable sum," Xavier said carefully. "You have no family who could help." "My parents are dead. Samuel's brother lives in Virginia, but we have not spoken in years. They fought before we married." Grace laughed bitterly. "I wrote him anyway, weeks ago, never got a reply." Xavier looked down at his boots, then back up at her. His jaw worked as though he was wrestling with something. "There might be another way," he said slowly. "But you would have to trust me, and it would require you to make a decision fast." Grace studied him. She knew almost nothing about Xavier Ramsey beyond what 3 weeks of working together had revealed. He was somewhere near 30 years old, she guessed, perhaps 5 or 6 years older than herself. He worked harder than any man she had employed since Samuel's death. He spoke little but listened well. He had gentle hands with the horses and had fixed the broken corral gate without being asked. That was the sum of her knowledge about the man now looking at her with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "What way?" she asked. "The bank cannot foreclose on a ranch if the debt is assumed by a new owner with means to pay," Xavier said. "And by Texas law, when a woman marries, her husband's assets become available to settle her debts." Grace felt her face flush. "Mr. Ramsey, are you suggesting—" "I am suggesting that if you were to marry me this afternoon, I could sign papers taking responsibility for the debt. I have money saved, Mrs. Larson, enough to cover what you owe and then some." She stared at him, certain she had misheard. "That is insane. You do not even know me. Why would you tie yourself to a failing ranch and a widow's debts?" Xavier's expression remained steady. "I know you get up before dawn and work until your hands bleed. I know you talk to your husband's grave every Sunday morning. I know you have not eaten a proper meal in days because you have been giving your portions to the hands who are still here. I know you love this land enough to fight for it even when fighting seems pointless." He paused. "And I know I have been drifting for 5 years looking for a place that feels like home. This is the first place that has felt like anything but another stop." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with implications Grace was not sure she could process. Her mind spun. It was madness. Absolute madness. Yet as she looked past Xavier toward the barn Samuel had built, the corrals they had mended together, the house where she had imagined raising children, she felt something desperate and fierce rise in her chest. "I do not love you," she said bluntly. "I barely know you." "I know that," Xavier replied. "I am not asking for love, Mrs. Larson. I am offering a business arrangement that happens to require a marriage certificate. You keep your ranch. I get a place to settle. We figure out the rest as we go." Grace looked down at the crumpled notice in her hand. 3 hours and 45 minutes, until the banker arrived with the sheriff and legal papers. 3 hours and 45 minutes, until everything Samuel had worked for was sold to the highest bidder, probably Marcus Thornton, who owned the neighboring spread and had been circling like a vulture since the funeral. "The preacher," she said suddenly. "Reverend Walsh is in town today. I saw him at the general store this morning." Xavier's eyes widened slightly. "Is that a yes?" "It is a practical solution to an impossible problem," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But Mr. Ramsey, I need you to understand something. I married for love once. I will not pretend this is the same thing. This is survival, nothing more." "I understand," he said quietly. "Though I will say, Mrs. Larson, that survival is not nothing. Sometimes it is everything." They rode into Eagle Pass together, Grace on her mare and Xavier on his gelding, the noon sun turning the landscape into wavering impressions of earth and sky. Grace's mind raced with the impossibility of what she was about to do: marry a virtual stranger. Bind her life to a man whose past she knew nothing about, whose future plans remained a mystery. It violated every notion of propriety and sense she had been raised with. Yet here she was, guiding her horse down the main street toward the white church at the end of town, its simple cross stark against the blue Texas sky. Reverend Walsh was locking the church door when they arrived. He turned, surprised, as Grace and Xavier dismounted. "Mrs. Larson," he said, his weathered face crinkling with concern. "Is everything all right?" "No, Reverend, it is not," Grace said, her voice tight. "The bank is foreclosing this afternoon, but Mr. Ramsey has offered to help by marrying me so his assets can cover my debts. We need you to perform the ceremony immediately." The Reverend's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. "Mrs. Larson, this is highly irregular. Marriage is a sacred covenant, not a financial arrangement." "I know what marriage is supposed to be," Grace said, and her voice cracked despite her best efforts. "I had that once. This is different. This is desperation. But it is also legal, and it will save my home. Will you help us or not?" Reverend Walsh looked between them, his expression troubled. Finally, he sighed. "I will need witnesses. You cannot marry without 2 witnesses present." Xavier glanced down the street. "The general store is open. Mr. Peterson and his wife are usually there this time of day." 10 minutes later, they stood in the dim interior of the church with Henry Peterson and his wife Martha serving as reluctant witnesses. Martha kept shooting Grace concerned looks, as if she feared the widow had lost her mind entirely. Perhaps she had. Grace could hardly feel her own feet on the wooden floor. Everything had taken on a dreamlike quality, as though she was watching this happen to someone else. Reverend Walsh opened his Bible, his voice formal as he began the ceremony. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Grace barely heard the words. She focused instead on Xavier's hands, rough and calloused from years of hard work. Working man's hands, honest hands. When the Reverend asked if anyone objected, the silence stretched painfully long. Grace half expected someone to burst through the doors, to declare this entire plan foolish or illegal or both. Do you, Xavier Ramsey, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do, Xavier said, his voice steady and clear. The Reverend turned to Grace. Do you, Grace Larson, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? Grace's mouth was dry. She thought of Samuel, of the vows she had spoken to him 7 years ago in this very church. Different words, same promises. But that had been love, bright and burning and real. This was something else entirely. I do, she whispered. By the authority vested in me by the state of Texas and Almighty God, I now pronounce you man and wife. Reverend Walsh closed his Bible with a soft thump. You may kiss your bride. Xavier looked at Grace, a question in his eyes. She gave the smallest nod and he leaned in, pressing his lips briefly to hers. It was chaste, formal, nothing like the passionate kisses she had shared with Samuel. Yet something about the gentleness of it made Grace's eyes burn with unexpected tears. Congratulations, Martha Peterson said weakly, clearly unconvinced this was anything to celebrate. They signed the marriage certificate, Henry and Martha adding their signatures as witnesses. Reverend Walsh handed the document to Grace, his expression still troubled. I hope you know what you are doing, Mrs. Ramsey. The name hit Grace like a physical blow. Mrs. Ramsey, no longer Mrs. Larson. She had shed her husband's name for a stranger's in the space of 15 minutes. I hope so too, she managed. They rode directly to the bank, the marriage certificate folded carefully in Xavier's shirt pocket. Grace's hands shook on the reins. Everything was happening too fast, her life transforming in ways she could barely comprehend. When they entered the bank, she saw Marcus Thornton standing near the teller window, his expensive suit and oiled hair a stark contrast to the dusty ranchers who typically frequented the establishment. He turned when they entered, his eyes narrowing. Grace, he said smoothly. I was just discussing the auction terms with Mr. Harrison. I plan to make a fair offer for your property. There will be no auction, Grace said, her voice cold. And it is Mrs. Ramsey now. Thornton's face darkened as he looked between Grace and Xavier. What is this? Mr. Harrison, Xavier said, addressing the banker who had emerged from his office. My wife's debts are now my responsibility as her husband. I would like to discuss payment terms. James Harrison adjusted his spectacles, looking flustered. Mr. Ramsey, is it? I am afraid the matter has progressed beyond simple payment plans. The foreclosure documents are already prepared. Tear them up, Xavier said calmly. He pulled a leather pouch from inside his vest and set it on the counter with a heavy thunk. There is $800 in gold coin. I can have the remaining $400 within a week. The debt will be paid in full. Harrison's eyes widened. He picked up the pouch, testing its weight, then opened it to examine the contents. Thornton moved closer, his face reddening. This is a sham, Thornton said sharply. Harrison, you cannot let them manipulate you like this. That woman has been delinquent for months. That woman is my wife, Xavier said quietly, but there was steel in his voice. And you will address her with respect or not at all. Harrison cleared his throat nervously. If the marriage is legal and Mr. Ramsey has the means to satisfy the debt, then I am afraid the foreclosure cannot proceed, Mr. Thornton. The law is quite clear on this matter. Thornton's jaw clenched. He stared at Grace with barely concealed anger. You would marry a drifter rather than accept a legitimate offer for your land. I would do whatever necessary to keep what my husband and I built, Grace said evenly. And yes, That includes marrying a good man who was willing to help me when everyone else stood by and watched me drown." Thornton made a disgusted sound and stormed out of the bank, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the windows. Harrison watched him go, then turned back to Xavier and Grace with a sigh. "Let me draw up the paperwork," he said. "And Mr. Ramsey, I will need to see the marriage certificate to verify the legality of this arrangement." An hour later, they rode back to the ranch as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Grace felt numb, as though she had used up every emotion she possessed in the span of a few hours. She was married again. The ranch was saved. Nothing would ever be the same. Xavier was quiet beside her, seemingly content to let the silence stretch. It was not until they reached the ranch gates that Grace finally spoke. "Where did you get $800 in gold?" Xavier glanced at her. "I have been saving for 5 years, working cattle drives, breaking horses, taking whatever jobs paid well. I always knew I wanted to buy land eventually, just never expected to acquire it quite this way." "You could have bought your own ranch with that money," Grace said. "Started fresh somewhere without inheriting someone else's debts and grief." "Perhaps," Xavier said. "But land is more than just dirt and grass, Mrs. Ramsey. It is what you build on it that matters. You already have something built here, something worth saving. That appealed to me more than starting from nothing." They reached the house and dismounted. Grace stood awkwardly by her horse, suddenly aware that this man was now her husband, that he would be living in her house, that the careful boundaries she had maintained for the past 3 weeks had just been obliterated. "You can take the spare room," she said quickly. "The one at the end of the hall. It is small but clean." Xavier nodded slowly. "I appreciate that. I know this is not a real marriage, Mrs. Ramsey. I will not presume anything beyond what we agreed to." "Grace," she said quietly, "if we are married, you should probably call me Grace." "Grace," he repeated, and something about the way he said her name made her chest tighten. "And you should call me Xavier. We can dispense with the formalities, at least in private." That night, Grace lay awake in the bed she had shared with Samuel, staring at the ceiling and listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person in the house. Xavier moved quietly, but she could hear the creak of floorboards as he settled into the spare room, the soft sound of a window being opened. She kept expecting to feel guilty, as though she had betrayed Samuel's memory by marrying again so soon. Instead, she felt only a strange, hollow relief. The ranch was safe. She had bought herself time. Whatever came next, at least she would face it from home. The next morning, Grace woke before dawn as always and dressed quickly. When she entered the kitchen, she found Xavier already there, feeding wood into the stove to heat water for coffee. "You do not have to do that," she said, startled. He looked up. "I have been waking early my whole life. Hard habit to break." He poured water into the coffee pot. "Besides, if we are going to make this work, we both need to contribute. That was the arrangement, was it not? We are partners in this." Partners. The word settled over Grace with unexpected comfort. She had felt so alone since Samuel died, carrying the weight of the ranch entirely on her shoulders. The idea of sharing that burden, even with a stranger, made something in her chest loosen. They worked together that morning, checking fences in the eastern pasture. Xavier proved to be good company, pointing out places where the wire needed reinforcing without making Grace feel incompetent. They talked little, but the silence between them was comfortable rather than strained. It was during lunch, eating cold biscuits and jerky while sitting on a hillside overlooking the ranch, that Xavier finally volunteered information about his past. "I grew up in Missouri," he said, squinting at the horizon. "My father had a small farm. Nothing like this, just enough land to scrape by. He died when I was 16 and my mother followed a year later. I sold the farm and started drifting. Told myself I was looking for opportunity, but mostly I was just running from the grief. Grace understood that impulse. What made you stop running? Xavier was quiet for a long moment. I got tired, he said simply. Tired of waking up in different places, tired of having nothing that mattered, tired of being alone. When I rode onto your ranch 3 weeks ago looking for work, something just felt different. Felt right, he looked at her. I know that probably sounds foolish. No, Grace said softly, it does not sound foolish at all. The days began to develop a rhythm. They worked the ranch together. Grace showing Xavier the intricacies of managing the land, while Xavier contributed his considerable skills with horses and cattle. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sun set and talking about plans for the future. Grace found herself looking forward to these conversations, to Xavier's steady presence beside her. 3 weeks after the wedding, Xavier rode into town to deliver the final $400 to the bank. He returned in the late afternoon, his expression troubled. What is wrong? Grace asked as he dismounted. Ran into Marcus Thornton in town, Xavier said. He made it clear he is not happy about losing the ranch, said some things I would rather not repeat. Grace felt a chill despite the warm air. What kind of things? Threats, mostly. Veiled ones, but threats nonetheless. He implied that accidents happen, that debt might not be the only way to lose a ranch. Xavier's jaw tightened. I do not trust him, Grace. We need to be careful. That night, Xavier moved his bedroll into the main house's parlor, positioning himself between the front door and the hallway leading to Grace's room. She protested, saying it was unnecessary, but he was adamant. If Thornton tries anything, I want to be between him and you, Xavier said firmly. Humor me on this. Grace relented, touched by his protectiveness despite herself. She lay in bed that night listening to Xavier settle in the parlor, and for the first time since Samuel's death, she felt safe. The attack came a week later in the dead of night. Grace woke to the sound of breaking glass and Xavier's shout. She grabbed the rifle she kept beside her bed and ran into the hallway, her heart pounding. In the dim moonlight filtering through the windows, she could see Xavier grappling with a figure near the front door. Another man was climbing through the broken parlor window. Stop right there, Grace said coldly, raising the rifle. The man at the window froze. Xavier managed to wrestle his opponent to the ground, pinning him. In the moonlight, Grace recognized one of Thornton's ranch hands. Tell Thornton if he sends anyone else onto this property. I will not be so gentle, Xavier growled, hauling the man to his feet and shoving him toward the door. Both intruders fled into the night, leaving only the sound of hoofbeats fading into the darkness. Xavier turned to Grace, breathing hard. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye. Are you all right? I am fine, Grace said, lowering the rifle with shaking hands. But you are hurt. She lit a lamp and made Xavier sit at the kitchen table while she cleaned the cut with water and whiskey. He winced but did not complain as she worked. In the lamplight, she could see the bruises forming on his jaw and knuckles. You could have been killed, she said quietly. So could you, Xavier replied. That is why I am here, Grace, to make sure that does not happen. Grace pressed a cloth to the cut, holding it in place. Xavier's hand came up to cover hers, warm and calloused. They stayed like that for a moment, frozen, Grace's hand trapped beneath his, their faces close in the lamplight. Xavier, she whispered, and then she was not sure what else to say. The words tangled in her throat, emotions she had been carefully suppressing for weeks suddenly threatening to overwhelm her. I know, he said softly. I know this was supposed to be just a business arrangement, but Grace, I have to tell you something. Somewhere along the way, somewhere between fixing fences and watching sunsets and learning the way you laugh when you are surprised. This stopped being just business for me. Grace's breath caught. Xavier, I cannot. It is too soon. Samuel has only been gone 6 months. I am not asking you to feel the same way, Xavier said. I just needed you to know. I would have married you that afternoon even if I had nothing to gain from it, just to keep you from losing this place. Because somewhere in those 3 weeks before the bank notice, I had already started falling for you. Tears burned Grace's eyes. That is not fair. You cannot say things like that. Why not? Xavier asked gently. Because it makes this complicated, Grace. It was already complicated. But I would rather have complicated and honest than simple and hollow. Grace pulled her hand away, standing abruptly. I need time. I need to think. Take all the time you need, Xavier said. I am not going anywhere. The next morning, Grace rode into town alone, needing space to clear her head. She went to the cemetery, to the hill where Samuel was buried. Sitting beside his grave, she talked to him the way she always did, pouring out her confusion and guilt. I did not mean for this to happen, she said softly. I married him to save the ranch. That was all it was supposed to be. But Samuel, he is good. He is kind and hardworking, and he looks at me like I am something precious. And I feel so guilty for even noticing that, for feeling anything at all when you have only been gone 6 months. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers. Grace closed her eyes, remembering Samuel's laugh, his strong arms, the way he had loved her so completely. But the memories were softening at the edges now, becoming less like fresh wounds and more like cherished treasures she could hold without bleeding. I think you would like him, she whispered. I think you would be glad I am not alone. When Grace returned to the ranch that evening, she found Xavier repairing the broken window, carefully fitting new glass into the frame. He looked up when she approached but did not speak, giving her space. I loved my husband, Grace said without preamble. I loved him with everything I had. And when he died, I thought I would never feel anything like that again. Did not want to feel anything like that again, because loving someone that much means you can lose them that completely. Xavier set down his tools, giving her his full attention. But you are right, Grace continued. This has become more than a business arrangement. I do not know when it happened exactly. Maybe it was watching you fix the corral gate that first week without being asked. Maybe it was the way you talked to the horses like they are old friends. Maybe it was seeing you willing to fight for this place for me when you had no real obligation to do so. She took a breath. I am scared, Xavier, scared of losing someone again, scared of betraying Samuel's memory, scared of getting this wrong. Xavier crossed to her slowly. I am scared too, he admitted. I have never felt like this about anyone, never wanted to stay anywhere long enough to put down roots. But Grace, I would rather be scared with you than safe and alone, and I do not think loving someone new means betraying what you had before. I think it means you are brave enough to risk your heart again. Grace looked up at him, at this man who had ridden into her life at her darkest moment and somehow become her salvation in more ways than she had ever imagined. I am not ready to say I love you, she said honestly. Not yet. But I want to try. I want to see where this could go if we let it. A smile broke across Xavier's face, transforming his usually serious expression. That is all I am asking for. A chance. He took her hand carefully as though she might bolt. Grace let him, her fingers curling around his. It felt different from holding Samuel's hand, different from anything she had known before. But it felt right in its own way, a new beginning rather than a replacement for what she had lost. We will take it slow, Xavier said. As slow as you need. Grace nodded, then surprised herself by leaning forward and kissing him. It was brief, tentative, nothing like the passionate kiss she had shared with Samuel on their wedding night. But it was real, and it was hers to give, and that made it precious. The summer unfolded with a new sweetness. Grace and Xavier courted each other the way they had never had the chance to do before their hasty wedding. Xavier brought her wildflowers from the meadow and helped her plant a vegetable garden near the house. Grace taught him her mother's recipe for peach pie and laughed when he burned the first attempt. They rode together in the evenings, exploring the furthest corners of the ranch, talking about everything and nothing. Marcus Thornton made no more direct attacks, but Grace often saw his ranch hands watching from across the property line, their presence a constant reminder of the threat that lingered. Xavier hired 2 more hands to help with the work and ensure someone was always present at the ranch. Grace protested the expense, but Xavier was firm. "I will not risk you," he said simply, and the look in his eyes made Grace's heart flutter. One evening in August, they sat on the porch watching a thunderstorm roll across the distant hills. Lightning flickered on the horizon, and the air smelled of rain and possibility. Xavier had his arm around Grace's shoulders, and she leaned into his warmth, marveling at how natural it felt. "I have been thinking," Xavier said carefully, "about making some improvements to the house. Adding on a couple of rooms, maybe." Grace looked up at him. "That would be expensive. We just finished paying off the debt." "I know," Xavier said, "but I have been thinking about the future, about what we might need down the road." He paused, his cheek coloring slightly. "Children need their own rooms." Grace's breath caught. They had not discussed children, had barely acknowledged that their marriage was becoming real in every sense. But the thought of Xavier's children, of raising a family together on this land, sent a warm rush through her chest. "Are you asking me something, Xavier Ramsey?" she said softly. He turned to face her fully. "I am saying that what started as a marriage of convenience has become the most real thing in my life. I am saying that I love you, Grace. Not because you needed saving or because I wanted land, but because you are brave and stubborn and kind, and every day with you feels like a gift I did not know I was allowed to have." He took her hand. "So yes, I am asking. I am asking if you think you might want a real marriage with me. Children, growing old together, all of it." Grace felt tears spill over, but they were not sad tears. They were the tears of something long frozen finally thawing, of allowing herself to hope again, to dream again. "I love you too," she whispered. "I did not think I could feel this way again, but Xavier, I do. I love you." He kissed her then, deep and tender, and Grace kissed him back with all the emotion she had been holding inside for months. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, the first drops of rain had begun to fall, cool and sweet on their skin. That night, Grace invited Xavier into her room, into the bed she had once shared with Samuel. It felt like a final letting go, a blessing given to move forward. Xavier loved her gently, reverently, as though she was something precious. And afterward, lying in his arms listening to his heartbeat, Grace felt a peace she had not known in months. Samuel would always be part of her story, a chapter written in love and loss. But Xavier was her present and her future, and that was its own kind of beautiful. Autumn arrived with cooler temperatures and harvest time. The ranch flourished under their combined management, the cattle healthy and the land productive. Word spread through Eagle Pass about the widow who had saved her ranch by marrying a drifter, and while some tusked about the impropriety, most grudgingly admitted they had made it work. On a crisp October morning, Grace woke feeling ill. She barely made it out of bed before nausea overtook her. Xavier found her in the washroom, her face pale and clammy. "Are you all right?" he asked, worry creasing his brow. Grace sat back, realization dawning. "I think I might be pregnant." Xavier's eyes went wide. "Are you sure?" "Not completely, but the signs are there." Grace touched her stomach wonderingly. "Xavier, we are going to have a baby." The joy on his face was so pure, so complete, that Grace felt her own eyes fill with tears again. He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully as though she might break. "A baby," he breathed. "Grace, this is wonderful," she laughed, the sound watery but genuine. "It will make the house very crowded. Maybe we should start on those additions." They began construction on the new rooms immediately, Xavier working alongside hired carpenters to expand the house before winter set in. Grace watched the walls go up, each board and nail a testament to the life they were building together. The ranch that had nearly been lost was now growing, transforming into something bigger than she had imagined. In late October, Marcus Thornton rode onto the property. Xavier immediately moved to intercept him, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. But Thornton held up his hands in a gesture of peace. "I am not here to cause trouble," he said gruffly. "I am here to make an offer, a legitimate one this time." Xavier and Grace exchanged glances. "What kind of offer?" Grace asked warily. "I want to buy your water rights for the South Creek," Thornton said. "My land borders yours there, but I do not have good access to water in that section. I will pay fair market price, and I will sign an agreement promising no further harassment or interference with your property." Grace studied him suspiciously. "Why the sudden change of heart?" Thornton shifted in his saddle. "Because I am tired of feuding, Mrs. Ramsey. And because my wife pointed out that trying to ruin a pregnant woman makes me look like a heartless bastard," he grimaced. "Word travels fast in a small town." Despite everything, Grace felt a laugh bubble up. "Your wife is a wise woman." "That she is," Thornton admitted. He named a price that was more than fair, enough to cover the cost of the house expansion and then some. Grace looked at Xavier. "What do you think?" "I think we can share water without losing anything important," Xavier said. "And I think having peace with our neighbors is worth more than holding a grudge." They negotiated terms and signed papers, Thornton's lawyer drawing up a binding agreement that protected both parties. When Thornton rode away, Grace felt as though a weight had been lifted. The threat that had loomed over them for months was finally resolved. Winter came gently that year, cold but not brutal. Grace's pregnancy progressed without complication, her body changing as new life grew within her. Xavier was attentive and tender, often placing his hand on her expanding belly to feel the baby kick, his face lighting up with wonder each time. "Do you hope for a boy or a girl?" Grace asked one evening as they sat by the fire. "I hope for healthy," Xavier said. "But if I am honest, I would love a son. Someone to teach about ranching and horses, to pass on what I know." Grace smiled. "I think Samuel would have wanted that too, a boy to carry on the legacy of this place." Speaking Samuel's name no longer hurt the way it once had. He was part of their story now, honored but not haunting. Grace had even shown Xavier the grave on the hill, and Xavier had stood respectfully silent, acknowledging the man who had loved Grace first. On a cold February morning in 1886, Grace went into labor. Xavier rode like hell into town to fetch the doctor and Mrs. Peterson, who served as the local midwife. The next hours were a blur of pain and effort, Grace clinging to Xavier's hand as waves of contractions racked her body. "You are doing so well," Xavier kept saying, his voice steady even though his face was pale. "Just a little longer, Grace. You can do this." And she did. As dawn light began to filter through the windows, Grace gave one final push and heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry. "It is a boy," Mrs. Peterson announced, wrapping the infant in clean blankets. "A healthy baby boy." Xavier's face was wet with tears as Mrs. Peterson placed the baby in Grace's arms. The infant was red-faced and squalling, perfect in every way. Grace looked down at her son, at Xavier's dark hair already visible on his tiny head, and felt love so fierce it nearly stopped her heart. "What should we name him?" Xavier asked, touching the baby's tiny hand with one calloused finger. Grace thought of Samuel, of Xavier, of the two men who had shaped her life. "Thomas," she said softly. "Thomas Samuel Ramsey, to honor the past and celebrate the future." "Thomas Samuel Ramsey," Xavier repeated, and his voice broke on the words. "That is perfect, Grace. He is perfect." The months that followed were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Thomas was a fussy baby who demanded constant attention, but Grace and Xavier took turns walking him through the house at night, soothing his cries. The ranch work continued, now with the added challenge of parenthood, but they managed. They always managed, working as a team the way they had from the beginning. On a warm May evening, nearly 2 years after that desperate afternoon when Grace had agreed to marry a stranger to save her land, they sat on the porch watching Thomas toddle around the yard, chasing a patient ranch dog. The house expansion was complete, the ranch was profitable, and the debts were nothing but memory. "I have been thinking about that day," Grace said quietly. "The day you offered to marry me. Do you ever regret it?" Xavier looked at her in genuine surprise. "Regret it?" "Grace, marrying you was the best decision I ever made. It gave me everything I had been searching for my whole life without even knowing I was searching. Even though it was not a real marriage at first," Grace pressed. "Even though I could not love you right away." "Especially because of that," Xavier said. "Because it means everything we have now we built together. We chose each other, Grace, not just once in a church, but every day after. That is more real than anything I could have imagined." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, watching their son play in the golden evening light. She thought about the woman she had been 2 years ago, desperate and grieving and alone. She thought about Xavier riding onto her land looking for work and finding a home. She thought about how the worst day of her life had somehow led to this, to joy and love and family. "I am glad you needed a job," she said softly. Xavier laughed and kissed the top of her head. "I am glad you needed a husband." As the sun set over the Texas plains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Thomas ran to them, his chubby arms outstretched. Xavier scooped him up, settling the boy on his lap, and Grace wrapped her arms around both of them. This was her family, hard-won and precious. This was her home, saved and rebuilt and filled with love. The ranch that had nearly been lost to creditors now thrived under their care. The marriage that had begun as a desperate bargain had become a love story for the ages. And Grace Ramsey, who had once believed her capacity for love had died with her first husband, had discovered that the human heart was more resilient than she had ever imagined. Years passed in the gentle rhythm of ranch life. Thomas grew strong and tall, his father's dark hair and his mother's determined spirit making him a force to be reckoned with. When he was 3, Grace discovered she was pregnant again, and 9 months later they welcomed a daughter they named Margaret. 2 years after that came another son, Daniel. The house that had once seemed too big for a lonely widow now rang with children's laughter. Xavier taught Thomas to ride and rope, to respect the land and the animals that depended on them. Grace taught Margaret to tend the garden and bake bread, passing on the skills her own mother had taught her. Daniel, still a toddler, followed his older siblings everywhere, determined to keep up despite his short legs. On summer evenings, the family would gather on the porch, Xavier and Grace in their chairs, children playing in the yard as the sun set. Sometimes Grace would catch Xavier watching her, and the love in his eyes still made her breath catch even after all these years. "What are you thinking about?" she would ask. "How lucky I am," he would always reply. How a desperate gamble turned into the greatest blessing of my life." And Grace would smile, because she knew exactly what he meant. The widow who had been losing her ranch to creditors had been saved by a cowboy who married her that afternoon. But more than that, they had saved each other, two lonely souls finding home in each other's arms. The ranch prospered under their stewardship, growing from the struggling property Grace had nearly lost into one of the most successful operations in Eagle Pass. They never forgot the hardship that had brought them together, the desperate afternoon when everything hung in the balance. It made them grateful for what they had built, made them appreciate each day as the gift it truly was. When Thomas was old enough to understand, Grace took him to the hill where Samuel was buried. She told him about his namesake, about the man who had first built the ranch they now called home. "Your father honors him by being a good man too," Grace said, holding her son's hand. "And you honor them both by growing up to be the same." Thomas looked at the grave with solemn eyes. "I will try, Mama." "That is all any of us can do," Grace said gently. Xavier had followed them up the hill, giving them space but staying close. When Thomas ran ahead to explore, Xavier came to stand beside Grace. "You are a good mother," he said quietly. "Samuel would be proud of the life you have built, of the children you are raising." "We are raising," Grace corrected. "Xavier, you are as much their father as you would be if you had been here from the beginning. Never doubt that." He pulled her close, and they stood together looking out over the ranch, at the cattle grazing peacefully, at the house with smoke rising from its chimney, at their children playing in the grass. This was what they had fought for, what they had risked everything to keep. And it had been worth every moment of fear, every sacrifice. As the years continued to pass, Grace and Xavier grew older together, their hair turning silver, their faces gaining lines from years of laughter and sun. Their children grew and eventually married, bringing grandchildren to visit the ranch. Thomas took over much of the day-to-day operations, proving himself as capable as his father. Margaret married a schoolteacher and moved to town, visiting often with her young family. Daniel chose to become a veterinarian, using his knowledge to help the ranching community. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Xavier surprised Grace by taking her back to the church, where they had married in such haste. Reverend Walsh had long since retired, replaced by a younger minister, but the building was the same. They stood in the same spot where they had spoken vows neither had truly understood at the time. "I want to renew our vows," Xavier said. "I want to stand here and promise you everything again, but this time meaning every word from the depths of my soul." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Xavier, we do not need a ceremony. We have proven our love every day for 20 years. "I know," he said, "but I want to do it anyway. I want to stand here and tell you that I would marry you all over again, 1,000 times over, and count myself the luckiest man alive each time." So they renewed their vows in the small church, their children and grandchildren serving as witnesses. This time, when Xavier kissed his bride, it was with the passion and certainty of 2 decades of love. This time, when they walked out of the church together, it was with the confidence of partners who had weathered every storm together and emerged stronger. Many more peaceful years passed on the ranch. Grace and Xavier eventually stepped back from the daily operations, content to watch Thomas and his wife manage the property while they enjoyed their grandchildren. They spent their days sitting on the porch, holding hands and watching the sun set over land they had fought so hard to keep. On a warm spring evening, when Grace was 68 and Xavier was 74, they sat together as they had so many times before. Xavier had been slowing down lately, his joints stiff with arthritis, his breath sometimes short. But his eyes were still bright when he looked at Grace, still filled with the love that had sustained them through decades. No regrets. Grace asked softly the question that had become their tradition. "Not a single one," Xavier replied, squeezing her hand gently. "You gave me everything, Grace. A home, a family, a purpose. You gave me a life worth living." "We gave each other that," Grace said. The widow and the cowboy who took a chance on each other when all seemed lost. Xavier smiled, that warm smile she had fallen in love with so many years ago. "Best afternoon of my life, marrying you to save this ranch, though I think the ranch ended up saving both of us." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Around them, their grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. The ranch stretched out before them, green and prosperous, a testament to everything they had built together. "I love you, Xavier Ramsey," Grace whispered. "I love you too, Grace Ramsey," he replied. "Today, tomorrow, and every day after that." They sat together as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and amber. Two souls who had found each other in desperation and created something beautiful from the ashes of loss. The ranch that had almost been lost still stood, would stand for generations to come, home to the family they had created together. And as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Grace thought about that desperate afternoon so long ago, when a stranger had offered her salvation, and she had been brave enough to accept it. It had been the beginning of everything, the moment her life had changed forever. She had been losing her ranch to creditors, and a cowboy had married her that afternoon to save it. But in saving the ranch, they had saved each other, and that had made all the difference. That had made everything possible. The fear, the risk, the leap of faith had led to this. A life filled with love, children, grandchildren, and the deep contentment of knowing they had built something lasting together. As darkness fell gently over the Texas plains, Grace and Xavier remained on the porch, hand in hand, surrounded by the life they had created. Their story had begun in desperation, but had become a testament to the power of love, trust, and choosing each other every single day. It was a story they would carry with them always. The widow and the cowboy who had gambled everything on each other and won more than they had ever dreamed possible. The end.